Today we're going to talk about garden planning. Before you put any seeds in the ground, you should sit down with a pencil and paper and ruler and draw yourself a scale garden plan. In that plan, write in detail every vegetable you intend to plant and precisely where you intend to plant it. The object of planning is to make the best use of the space available to you so that you can end up at the end of the season with the greatest variety and quantity of vegetables. Now, there are 5 principal things to take into account when you sit down to plan your garden. And the first one is personal preference. This is probably the first thing to take into account. Decide what vegetables you like to plant first of all, and then consider the rest of the considerations. Condition of soil, rotation, space-time, and companion planting. Let's go through these in somewhat more detail. Now, if you're starting to garden on a small scale for the first time, then it's probably worthwhile to try a little bit of everything and see what comes up. Sort of an experimental garden. But once you have some knowledge of gardening, and maybe you're enlarging the garden that you have, you should take into careful consideration the condition in which you find your soil and plant things in the soil which you know will do well there. If your soil has not been limed, you can assume that it's very acid. And it would probably be a good idea to plant potatoes or strawberries in that soil. If your soil is not deeply tilled, or if it's full of stones, then it probably isn't a good idea to plant a large crop of root vegetables like carrots, which require deeply tilled soil and stone-free soil. If you plant carrots in shallow, stone-rich soil, the roots will come out all misshapen and cracked and not very good-looking carrots, although they will taste just as good. Similarly, if your soil isn't drained well, plant shallow-rooted crops rather than deep-rooted crops. If your soil is low in fertility, plan to plant light feeders or legumes. These will build up the fertility of the soil. However, hopefully, eventually all your soil will be deeply dug and well drained and fertile and free of rocks. And then you can forget the first consideration. You can forget about the condition of your soil because your soil is in good condition, and you can go on to considering these other considerations: rotation, space-time, and companion planting. Now, there are 2 types of rotation that I want to tell you about: the 3-year and the 4-year variety. Last year, in my garden, I described the 3-year rotation. Rotation is a concept central to the practice of organic gardening. The idea of rotation, the practice of rotation, has been known since the dawn of agriculture. In this small garden, you see the concept of rotation in practice. You see, there are 3 principal beds. And what we're practicing here is a 3-year rotation. Over a period of 3 years, we're going to move the cole crops, the cabbages, the cauliflowers, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts. We're going to move them from here this year. Next year, we're going to plant them here in this bed. And next year, we're going to plant them here. On the 4th year, we'll return to the original arrangement. Now, there are several reasons for rotating our crops. Soils tend to get depleted if you grow the same crops in them year after year. Each crop makes certain demands on the soil. So if you grow the same crop year after year, it removes these essential nutrients from the soil, and your resulting harvest is going to be reduced. Even more important is if you grow the same crops in the particular piece of ground year after year, you're inviting a buildup of insect pests and disease organisms. The cole crops are particularly susceptible to what's known as clubroot, which is a fungal disease of the roots. Now, if you grow cabbages in the same plot year after year, eventually you're going to get a clubroot infestation, and you won't be able to grow any cabbages there for many years after. But if you follow a very careful rotational habit, you should be able to avoid an infestation of clubroot. All right, so there are 3 different beds in the garden. The first one are the cole crops, and these are the heavy feeders. These take the most of the nutrients out of the soil. The legumes feed very lightly, and in fact, they enrich the soil by taking atmospheric nitrogen and changing it into fixed nitrogen in the soil. They have the effect of enriching the soil. And this bed are the root crops and the leafy vegetables. The root crops are the carrots and the beets and the turnips and the parsnips. The leafy vegetables are the chard and the lettuces and the spinach, things like that. The root crops feed moderately from the soil. They don't need as rich a soil as the cole crops require. So the schedule which you're going to follow is next year you're going to put the cole crops in the garden that you planted legumes. You plant the legumes in the garden where you planted the root crops, and take the root crops and place them back in the cole crop area. Before you plant your cole crops, the area you're going to plant your cole crops in, you want to give a good enrichment, soil enrichment. You want to add manure in the fall, or you want to add a good application of compost in the spring. The main difference between the 3 and the 4 year rotation is the exclusion or inclusion of potatoes in the rotational cycle. For the past 2 or 3 years, I've been practicing the 3-year rotation, which I just described. And I've been keeping a separate plot for potatoes. My reasoning was that most vegetables like well-limed soil, and potatoes prefer moderately acid soil. Recently, however, I've begun to reassess my stand on a 3-year rotation, as it doesn't make much sense to leave potatoes growing in one area year after year. You're going to have the same buildup of pests and diseases with potatoes. British gardeners practice a 4-year rotation, which goes something like this. And this rotation is described in volume number 36 of the Mother Earth News. Potatoes do not like lime, but they do like heavy dressings of muck and compost. In any case, you should not lime and muck at the same time, for the lime attacks the muck or manure and removes the nitrogen from it. Therefore, plant potatoes in land which has just been freshly manured but hasn't had lime added. The next year, lime this plot of ground and plant your brassicas. The brassicas will benefit from the heavy application of manure applied the previous year, and they require a heavy input of lime, which the potatoes don't require. The next year, the third year, the legumes, peas, beans, and clovers, are planted. The legumes like lime, but they don't require the heavy input of nutrients, much of which has been used up by the potatoes and brassicas. And then in the fourth year, you could have what they call a root break. This could come after the peas and beans. Parsnips, carrots, these various root plants, as I've told you before, feed lightly, and they prefer a less nutrient soil. If you plant carrots and parsnips in heavily manured soil, they will have a tendency to crack and split. After the root break, the lime, which was applied 3 years previously, will have mostly been dissipated, so you can manure heavily again and plant potatoes. Now, I can't recommend the 4-year rotation to you on the basis of my experience, but it does sound like a reasonable kind of rotation. Starting this summer, I'm going to start putting one of my gardens into a 4-year rotation and see how it works out. Now, space-time requirements. Each vegetable requires a certain amount of time and space to reach maturity. It requires a certain amount of time and space both above the soil and a certain amount below the soil. And if you learn the time-space requirements of your vegetables, you can use this information to maximize the quantity and variety of your crop. Here are a few pointers to remember. Try to maximize your growing space and minimize your path space. If you use raised beds, you can sow some vegetables in a two-dimensional array rather than in one-dimensional rows. For instance, try broadcasting carrots over a small section of your garden instead of planting them in nice, neat rows. If you are careful not to seed too heavily, you'll harvest a large crop of carrots with very little input of effort. We'll have more on this in the lecture on seeding. In the garden, the ideal that you should be striving for is to have the maximum amount of your garden covered by vegetable leaves for the longest possible period of time. And also, the ideal should be that each plant should have sufficient room to grow to maturity. Now, this is a pretty hard ideal to achieve. But people skilled in gardening, skilled in intensive gardening, approach this ideal. When a garden is totally covered by greenery of our vegetables, hopefully not our weeds, we say that it is covered by a living mulch. The soil below there is loose and moist and fertile, and the weeds are discouraged from growing. Think of a bare garden as a naked, unprotected garden. The object of the gardener is to clothe that garden as quickly as possible. This can be done by, one, planting your seeds in specially prepared seeding areas, not out in the garden, but in special transplanting areas. And once your plants have reached a certain height, 2 or 3 inches, and you dig them from these areas where you can plant them quite densely and transplant them out into the garden at the proper distance from each other. The Chinese go as far as transplanting wheat into their wheat fields. The Chinese transplant practically everything, and they are surely the masters of intensive agriculture and gardening. In the session on seeding and transplantation, I will go into more detail about what plants I transplant out into the garden. You can make better use of your garden by overseeding certain vegetables and then using the thinnings of vegetables like beets and turnips for fresh greens. You can increase the utilization of your garden space by interplanting. Another strategy, which I think we can demonstrate here, is growing long season plants beside short season plants. Here's some peas and beans, and here's some radishes. These radishes only take a very brief time to come to maturity, and then they'll be pulled out. And when they're pulled out, the peas and beans will have grown up sufficiently to have completely covered over this area. Now, if we'd followed the instructions of the seed package, we would have put a row of peas here and a row of peas and beans here and left all this area blank. But by taking advantage of the fact that some plants will mature faster than others, we can use these empty spaces with short season plants, and the space will not be wasted while these long season plants are growing up to take their place. Companion planting considerations. Many gardeners believe that when planting your garden, you should take into account the preferences of your plants. It may come as a surprise to you that plants, like animals and people, have definite likes and dislikes when it comes to choosing neighbors. For your use, I will include with this program a table which shows you the likes and dislikes of various vegetables. At this stage in the development of my ideas, I'm going to have to present companion planting to you as an article of faith. The idea is ecologically sound, and I believe that those experienced gardeners have to tell me, I believe what they're telling me, and I'm prepared to follow them just so far. However, I also have to admit that so far in my gardens I've seen little evidence that companion planting helped the growth of my vegetables or protected them from insect pests. I will simply have to do more work before I can make a definite statement one way or the other. I advise you to try experimenting with companion planting. If it doesn't help, it certainly isn't going to hurt. Here are a few simple rules to follow. Plant short-season leafy vegetables like spinach next to peas and beans. Not only will they be out of the ground before the peas and beans need the space, but these leafy vegetables will be able to take advantage of the nitrogen-fixing abilities of the legumes. Plant tall plants to the north of short plants. This means that both will get an equitable amount of sunlight. Plant root vegetables like parsnips and carrots and turnips, beets, next to leafy vegetables. The root vegetables will take up nutrients from a certain location in the soil. The leafy vegetables will take up nutrients from a different location in the soil. The leafy vegetables will take up a lot of space above the soil, and the leafy vegetables, the root vegetables, will take up less space above the soil. Plant aromatic plants. Aromatic plants are plants that smell strongly when you crush their leaves. Plant aromatic plants next to plants which are susceptible to insect attack. Aromatic plants evolved strong-smelling chemicals over millions of years as a way to protect themselves from insect attack. The odor they give off repels insects. So if you plant herbs like summer savory, dill, basil, sweet marjoram, or you may plant onions, garlic, or leeks, or flowers like nasturtiums and marigolds, all of which have insect repellent chemicals in them. If you plant these plants next to susceptible plants like brassicas, you may be able to repel insects which like to eat the cola crops by the heavy odor of the aromatic plants planted all around them. I think it works to a certain extent, but don't rely on it as a total solution to your insect problems. Now that we're at the close of this lecture, I expect that you are totally confused. I have to admit that I share some of your confusion, because some of the guides are directly contradictory. I ask you to think about the various ideas that I've told you about. I encourage you to read a lot. I encourage you to draw up garden plans, trying to incorporate these different ideas. I also predict that when you get out into your garden, many of your plans will have to be revised when faced with the practical requirements of space and time within the garden. As an example of a garden plan, I will review with you my plan for one of my gardens from last year. My garden was 40 feet long, and here I indicate in feet the length along the garden. I planted my vegetables in rows across the garden in this way. The first thing that I took into account was I divided the garden into 3 major gardens: the cole crops, the roots and greens, and the legumes. Let's look at the cole crops first. In foot number 1, I planted Savoy cabbage. In foot number 3, I planted broccoli. In foot number 5, I planted cauliflower. 7, broccoli. 9, Brussels sprouts. 11, cauliflower. 13, cabbage. You can see that I planted cole crops every 2 feet. In between these cole crops, I planted plants which required less time or less space. For instance, I planted dill between the Savoy and the broccoli, and garlic between the broccoli and the cauliflower, onion sets here, spinach, which came out rapidly between the broccoli and Brussels sprouts, onion sets, Swiss chard. I don't recommend this as a perfect example of how to plant a garden. For instance, I would never plant onion sets between 2 rows of cole crops again. They simply get squashed out. And the onion sets are valuable, and they produce a valuable vegetable. So if I was going to plant onions between 2 rows of cole crops, I'd give them at least 2 or 3 feet so that the onions had lots of space to grow to maturity, because I don't want to lose them from being squashed there. I don't mind this space being used up because I take the spinach out. I don't mind the dill being squashed because the dill grows very tall and overshadows by a little bit the cabbage and broccoli, so that worked out. The garlic didn't work out, it just got squashed out by the broccoli and cauliflower. So you're going to have to try out various things and learn by experience. Now, going out of the cole crop garden into the root crop garden, we go to beets. Beets, leeks, carrots and radish, chicory, parsley, beet, lettuce, turnip. What are we doing here? Root crops, leafy crops, aromatic crops, root crops, leafy crops, herbs, aromatic crops, root crops, leafy crops, and so on down through the garden. Flowers, marigolds in here, brightens up the garden and adds an aroma which is supposed to repel insects from these very susceptible plants here. Turnips, summer turnip, endive, a leafy vegetable, a root vegetable, and an herb. Now, look at this here. Swede turnip, summer turnip. This goes against the previous instruction where these are brassicas and should be up in the cole crop section. From now on, this is where I'm going to put them because I'm ever so afraid of clubroot infestation. All right, getting out of the roots and greens, we're going into the legumes. Here we have yellow beans, 27.5. Green beans at 30. Late peas at 32.5. 5 feet, 2.5 feet, I'm sorry, between the different rows of legumes. And then in between, lettuce, which can take advantage of the beans and peas and comes out early, or summer savory, which can afford to be squashed a little bit. Next year, I'll give the summer savory more space, because I lost all this summer savory because it got squashed by the peas and beans. The positioning is all right, but it should have more space. Radish came out plenty early, so that worked out fine. Summer savory got squashed. Lettuce came out early enough so that this design worked out. So this is just one example of how you may work out these conflicting requirements for planning your garden. Growing right beside the chicory, I have planted carrots this year. And I've got chicory on this side of the bed and chicory on this side of the bed. 2 or 3 rows of carrots here, and I had a row of chard here. Now, I won't do that again next year. The chicory grew this way, and the chard grew that way, and the carrots were submerged by these rough, big plants, and they didn't come along as fast as they should. They were somewhat retarded, but they're not bad little carrots. Those are pretty small, but this is a small carrot anyway. This is called Amsterdam coreless. And for a surprisingly small amount of top growth, it produces a nice little carrot. Now over here, I also have chicory, and then I planted carrots, several rows of carrots. Then I planted a row of chard, which I cut down. And then I planted a row of 2 or 3 rows of carrots and a row of onions here. You see the onions? Okay, when you're talking about companion planting, and when you read about companion planting, they always talk about the chemical attractive or repellency of different plants. It's come to me this summer that perhaps we ought to consider the more obvious physical interaction of 2 plants. This plant and the chard overpowered this row of carrots. Overpowered it almost entirely. The carrots are rather small, whereas over here we've got some pretty, if I can get them out of the ground, pretty nice big carrots. See those? They were growing beside the onions. The onions came up as thin stalks, and the carrots came up beside them, and they weren't overpowered by their neighbor. The carrot roots, think about below the soil, the carrot roots went deep down into the soil and got their nutrients, and the onion roots spread out sideways and got their nutrients. So not only did the top foliage not compete, but the roots didn't compete. Next week, we're going to talk about seeding your garden and transplantation. See you next week.